This is where we stopped last time, right, in the previous session, and then we try to understand the structure of an if statement. So we are going to continue on that and build on that because there's a lot to check when you are programming, right? Yes. So I'm going to clean this and do something unique today. Now, what we are doing is that we are going to compare these two numbers that we have already. My number one is 23 and my number two is 24, right? So what we are going to do is that we are going to compare the two. We are going to tell Python that if my number one is greater than, is greater than my number two, then we are going to print my number one. So we are printing the bigger one, right? Yes. So this is the if statement for this particular. If my number one is greater than this, then this print belongs to this if statement. Remember the Ghana flag analogy, right? So this print belongs to this if statement. So this whole thing is one block. This if statement and there's indentation, and then whatever code is below it will follow an indentation. It means that this one belongs to the if statement. But then I want, if my number one is greater than my number two, then number one, you should print number one. I'm going to write it again. If I say this bracket is not compulsory in Python, so I'm going to clean it and just write my number two. If my number two is greater than my number one, now that's the opposite of what we did, right? Then semicolon, then you go to the next line. We are going to print my number two. We are now printing that number two is the bigger one. Okay. So now outside all these print statements, outside all of them, we are going to have a print statement say Python check all. So Python has checked all. So let's use that as an example, right? Okay. So this is what we have. So what we are doing basically is that we have my number one, which is 23, and my number two, which is 24. Let's assume that we don't know what's inside, but we are telling Python to check if my number one is greater than my number two, then you should print my number one. Remember, this one belongs to this if statement because of the indentation space here. We said that in the previous session. So now, when we are done with that, now you come and check if my number one is greater than my number two is now greater, right? Then we now print this. Else, what's happening is that then that's it. Then this one will be printed because this one does not belong to any of the if statements. So after all that, whatever happened at the top, this guy will always print, right? Okay. So let's run this and see what we have. Let's run it. Let me open my terminal, right? So the terminal is here. Wait, so we are seeing that 23 is printed and Python check all is also printed. Right, so Python check all is the last one here because it doesn't belong to any of the if statements, so it will always be printed. But then 23 is printed. 23 is what my number one. So my number one is greater than my number two. Python see that that particular statement is true. Once it's true, it will be able to run whatever was below it. So it will able to print the number one for us. When Python came here, you have my number two greater than my number one. But when you check, number two is 14 and number one is 23. And this statement is false. If this statement is false, Python will not run this. So if statements will only run the code below them when the condition is true. So this condition is not true, so it will ignore it, it will not run it, then it will come down here. Great, great, right? But there's an issue here. Imagine I am your brother or your relative, or imagine your mother sending you to a room, telling you that her, her phone is on, her phone is in the room. Okay, she said, when you go, check the bed. If the phone is on the bed, bring it. Then you go inside, you see the phone on the bed, you bring it, you give it to her. Now, as after you are out, now she take the phone, she has the phone, and she's telling you, go into the room, um when you see my phone on the table, bring it. What will be your reaction at that moment? Yes, you've checked the first one, you brought her the phone. Then she's telling you to go inside and check if the phone is on the table. How will you be? You'll be like, I've checked it already. Like, I've given you the phone already. I found it already. Why should I go inside again, right? You'll be wondering. Okay, let's look at another scenario that the first time when you enter the room, you didn't see it on the bed. So go into the room. Go into the room. If you see my phone on the bed, bring it. So you went inside, you didn't see it on the bed. So you come out and report that you didn't see it. Now she now tell you that go into the room, check on the table. If my phone is on the table, you bring it. You go inside, then you now see the phone on the table, then you bring it. Isn't that stressful? Why can't she just tell you that check on the bed? If it's on the bed, bring it. If it's not on the bed, check on the table at once. So that when you enter the room, you will do that activity at once before you come out. But by the time you come out, you know that you have checked all the possible checkpoints that she has told you. She has told you. But then she will tell you, um, go inside, then you come and report. You go inside, you come and report for all the possible checkpoints. What if you go inside at one command, then you check all the possible checkpoints, and then you bring the result out, whether you find it or not from all these checkpoints, instead of coming to take a new instruction each time. That's what we are doing here. Here we are doing an operation. The focus in the case that scenario that I gave you, the focus is on finding the phone, right? In our code here, the focus is on comparing the two numbers and printing the largest one. What we are doing, telling Python is that we are telling Python, just like the first case when you went and saw the phone on the bed, right? We tell Python to check this, to check my number one, and then you see that it is true. Then it was able to print that for us, meaning it's like you brought the phone, right? Now, when you proceed and come to this line, you're telling Python to check if my number one is greater than my number two, to go again and do the same activity. But ah, if it is human, right, you be wondering, but as a machine, right, it has to obey what you are doing. So Python is doing the same operation on the same numbers again, right? That's by using the another if statement. So an if statement is just like a passage. Let's consider it like um, it needs to work. Each condition needs to work on related items. So here we are checking two things. We are checking number one and number two. Since we are checking that, right, we need to make it a block thing. So when you enter the room, you check on the table, you check on this, you have to provide all the possible checkpoints. So what you are basically going to do, since there are only two numbers, right? You are going to check if my number one is greater than number two. If my number one is greater than number two. If it is greater than number two, then print it. Else, if it is not like that, then you print the other one, right? If my number one is not greater than number two, obviously, then number two will probably be greater than what? Number one, right? So go to the room, check my table. Check the bed. If it is not on the bed, then check the table. So there are only 2 points now: the bed and the table. Check on the bed. If it's not, the phone is not on the bed, then take it from the table, because it will definitely be there. There are only two things, right? Instead of coming out to go take another instruction and going in. So what will help us to avoid that confusion, right? To allow Python to prevent Python from doing the same operation again, as if starting again, going on and off, to improve performance, right? There is some particular thing that we use in programming. I'm going to clean this. Let me comment this one. Yes. So after the print, right? So what we have to do is we say else print my number two. Yes. So there's this else statement in Python. This one. So this one is if. Let me bring them closer. Let me put these ones as down, down, down. Okay. So there's if statement. If my number one is greater than number two, then you print it. Else you print that my number two. So else is just telling that okay, do this. If you go inside, do this. If you don't, if that particular thing is not true, else do another thing. Else do another thing. Right? So that's also so else help you to so when you go into the room at once, you're going to check the bed. If it's not there, then go and check the table, then you come back. So what Python is going to do, right? Python is not going to check my number one is greater than number two and come back and check my number two is greater than number one again. No, it will check my number one is greater than number two. If that condition is false, then it will just know that, oh, then the else has to be run. So to go and do the other one. So else is like providing the alternative. Providing the alternative. If a particular condition is false, right? Provide an alternative to just a direct alternative, regardless of whatever happens, right? If it is false, then do any other thing. That's what the else statement do, just like normal English. Okay. So this is what the else statement comes to do. So let's try to make this one false, right? If my number one is greater than my number two, so this statement will be true because my number one is 23, my number two is this thing. So when we run this, we'll be seeing the 23 again. But let me make number one 13. So my number one is 13 now. I've changed it. My number one is 13 now. So my number one is greater than my number two. This will now be false because number one is now 13, number two is 14. So this will now be false, right? So this particular conditions now will not run, right? And this will not run. This will not run. So Python will now see that this is false. So Python will now go to the else and print the else. So if the condition itself is wrong, is false, Python will go to the check if you have put any else statement there. So what should I do if that thing is false? So Python will go to the else and run whatever is there else. So let me clear the terminal and then we run this. Yeah, so we now have 14. Where's the 14 coming from? So number two is 14, right? You see that the first one, in this case, was false because number one is also false. So Python will go to the else. Python will go to the else and then run this. But then if you go back to the 23, if you go back to the 23 and then we run it, what do you think? So let me clear this. Yeah, so 23 is printed. 23 is printed because 23 is now greater than. So this first line will be run. This one will run, but not this because Python has seen that this one is run. So yeah, it will go ahead and just run that. So that's how else statement allows Python to be fast, quick when checking operations. So when you are doing an if statement, remember to most cases, right, provide Python a main condition and then provide an alternative when that particular main condition is false, right? Provide an alternative, and the way of doing that is doing an else statement. This is not all about that. There is more in the back about if statements. Let's see that in the next session.